All right, everybody. Well, I just want to say welcome. I know that this has been a uh, webinar that's been scheduled for a while and has been pushed a couple of times just because I've wanted to really get be able to give you the most out of it and wanted to make sure that I had enough information and kind of had everything ready to go for you. So we're going to record this and we'll end up posting it. So for those of you that are worried about schedules and things along those lines, you will have an opportunity, of course, to be able to go back and view the information again. So I know that many of you have been anticipating this webinar, so we're just going to jump right into it and give you the rundown here on the new CCNP Security and what all that entails. So, like I said, we want to do a little bit of a where we've been, and then I also want to talk about what the future looks like, do a little bit of a discussion on how to take advantage of these changes, and then also have a little bit of a Q&A where you can chat me some questions if you have any. Of course, you can always reach me on email or online. But I've been doing this CCNP Security for quite a long time. In fact, before it was called the CCNP Security. And so the security certifications for Cisco have really changed over the years. I remember back when they called it the CSS1. It was the Cisco Security Specialist. And, back around that time, they had courses like Managing Cisco Network Security or Cisco Secure PIX Firewall Advanced. You might be able to remember back to when the PIX Firewall was popular, and that was the box before the days of the ASA. I remember using the old IDS, the intrusion detection sensors, back when they used to say Net Ranger on them, or the CSVPN course back when the VPN products came from Altiga networks, and they were the VPN 3000 series concentrators. What you may recall if you've been involved in Cisco security certifications for a while is that all of those courses were very specific to those products, the PIX firewall, the IDSM, the VPN 3000 series concentrators, and of course then you had the MCNS, which covered sort of the general router and switch security. Well, as time went by, that program changed and became the CCSP, and so we were then called security specialists. And they had courses like SNRS, securing Cisco network routers and switches, and SNAF, securing networks with ASA, and that was the fundamentals course. They also had an advanced course. That was around the time that the PIX and the ASA were both covered in the same course. Actually, they had SNPA, securing networks with PIX and ASAs. They had the IPS course. So we saw as time went by, the IDS modules sort of evolved into an IPS module. And so we went from having 4210s to 4215s, and we had that big change where we now supported inline security, inline intrusion prevention, rather than having to just span everything over to this promiscuous port on an intrusion detection sensor. So that changed. We also had things like Clean Access NAC, or the Monitoring, Analysis, and Response System, the MARS box. So again, all of those courses that were in the Cisco security certifications were very, very product centric. And you sort of expected it. It was a Cisco program. And so you got a Cisco course, and that course covered some of the generals on how this technology worked. And then, okay, here's our product, and we're going to tell you everything that's going on in that product. And you would turn on all these features and these bells and these whistles and really things that you'd never really use in production, but that's how they were. Well, then we had the CCNP Security, and so we saw the security certification sort of roll under that same program pyramid that the routing and switching was under. We had the CCNA, which had basically routers and switches and some of the basics there. And then that moved us into the CCNP security courses, well, actually, let me take it back. That would roll us into the routing and switching CCNP program, which was, back in the days with the CCNP routing and switching, you had um, courses like um, building Cisco remote access networks, BCRAN. You had BSCI, building scalable Cisco internetworks. You had the course on building Cisco multi-layer switches, BCMSN. And you had CIT, Cisco Internet Network Troubleshooting. So the NP was this program that involved more courses, more training, and not only was it more training, it was deeper product knowledge. So you would really get into how Cisco dealt with things like HSRP and how that worked, or even VRRP when the switches started to support that. But again, very specific to the Cisco products, which there's nothing wrong with that. These are Cisco certifications. But they were really product training courses. So the CCNP Security kind of rolled up underneath that same pyramid. And so we had the CCNP Security, Firewall, VPN, IPS, and Secure. And we've had these for a while now. In fact, at one point in time, they dropped the E off of Secure, and it was still called Secure. It just was spelled a little bit different. The acronym was different. But my point is that this security certification that Cisco has had for us has really changed over the years. And so the most recent iteration of CCNP Security with Firewall 2.0, VPN 2.0, IPS, and Secure, in my opinion, was one of the best CCNP security programs that Cisco has ever released. Really good coverage of the firewalls and the VPNs and the IPS and so on. But it couldn't just stay where it was. Networking changes, job functions change. We've seen shifts in the way that things are done. We've seen more of a focus in identity management, and so things had to change with the CCNP security as well. So that's what's happened here is Cisco has updated the CCNP security, and I'm sure many of you already know this. They've updated the CCNP security to be able to handle the trends that we're seeing with a lot more identity management and threat control and new VPN technologies with IKE v2 and things along those lines. So let's talk about that. Okay, it's time for a change, and we know that. So the new CCNP security consists of 4 courses. So there's CENS, which is implementing Cisco Edge Network Security Solutions. Okay, so the descriptive name there should help you out with it. It's Edge Security. There's SITCS. I call it SITCS for short. That is implementing Cisco Threat Control Solutions. You have SIMOS, which is implementing Cisco Secure Mobility Solutions. And then the SISAS, which is implementing Cisco Secure Access Solutions. And I think as we start to dive into what's covered in these courses, you're going to find that they're much more focused on the current technologies that we see today. So let's start out with this CENS course. What I want to do is I'm just going to leave it on this slide, but I'm just going to kind of give a brain dump, if you will, of what is in this CENS course and what the idea behind it is. So in a nutshell, this CENS course is a course that's designed for giving you the knowledge that you need to be able to handle the ASA 5500X series next gen firewalls and so on. It's designed for edge network security. I mean, that's what it is. So what's happened is Cisco went through and started looking at job tasks and functional domains, and that's what they did. They worked the skills that are covered in this course under these functional domains. So if we looked at the different domains, there's the threat defense domain, there's the identity management domain, the security design and architecture domain, and then security operations management domain. So what they've done is they've taken those domains and then they've defined skills that fall underneath each of those domains, and that's what's taught in this course, the skills that would be found within each of those functional domains. So the way that this course works is it's a 5-day course that the Pearson exam is based on. This 5-day course covers a total of 5 modules. The first module is secure design principles. So we get to talk a little bit about edge network design. The second module is deploying network infrastructure protection. The third module is deploying NAT on our iOS routers and our ASAs. So we get to do NAT in both places now. And that's a big shift from the way that we used to do it before. We would cover NAT in the secure course, which was a router security course. And then we would also cover NAT in the firewall course, which was solely an ASA course. So SINS actually now contains both ASAs and iOS routers and their implementations as an edge network security device. So NAT would be done on both of those devices depending on how you've architected your network. The fourth module is on deploying threat control on the Cisco ASA. And then the fifth module is deploying threat control on Cisco iOS software. So that's a very, very high level look at what we would be doing in this course and the areas that you'll be tested on if you were to take the SENS exam. So you're working with 5515X with the IPS in them. We're also would have the 5512s. We take a look at those. The 2901s are the routers that you will be working with if you were to take this course. There's also the 3560 Catalyst switches that are in the course as well. So a number of more current equipment that you would see in here. The ASA version is 9.1 for those of you that are interested in that. Specifically developed for the course and the exam, what you'll actually be tested on will be the 9114 version of ASA and ASDM 712 version. You'll need to know, of course, things like botnet traffic filtering and things along those lines. And so that's a little bit about what kind of hardware you'll see in there. As far as who this course is designed for, it's really designed for anybody that's wanting to pursue Cisco security certifications. I think edge network security is a skill that you have to possess. So I'll go a little bit more into some of the details of the course, kind of what we look at in each of the modules, and give you an idea of really how deep this goes as far as the topics that are covered. But essentially, in the first module, which, as I mentioned, was about design, the first thing that we talk about is network security zoning, the network security zone implementation model, and some points with zone interfaces, placement of services, things along those lines. Then we go into Cisco's modular network architecture, and we talk about the modular network architecture principles and some design principles. And we take a look at an example network in there. We then go into the Cisco Secure X architecture, and we talk about that architecture and the components that are in that architecture. The course is specifically designed to teach you the architectures and the solutions, again, that Cisco is currently implementing. That's why the course in the first module also covers the Cisco TrustSec solution. So you get a nice overview of TrustSec and the TrustSec architecture and the different components that you're going to find in TrustSec. The second topic that's covered in SENS is the network infrastructure protection deployment, which is where you're going to implement data control and management plane security. Okay, so you got those multiple planes on the routers. You've got your data plane, you got your control plane, you got your management plane, and you're going to secure each of those. So we talk about network infrastructure protection. We talk about those different device planes and the different security controls that you have at the control plane and at the management plane and we also talk about what network telemetry is and how that works. We discuss some of the layer 2 and layer 3 data plane controls that we have to be able to secure our data plane. We also go into specifics of control plane security, infrastructure ACLs, policing, things along those lines, routing protocol authentication. You're going to find a lot of these topics are going to carry right over into CCIE security studies because they're all potential for the CCIE security. We also talk about, like I said, detailed management plane security, things like how to secure management access, things like how to secure SNMP v3 and run SNMP securely on our routers. We also talk about how to use AAA for management access and how to do that on our iOS devices. And we also talk about management plane security from the ASA's perspective. So we can implement management plane security controls on an ASA. We can lock that down and we can use AAA for our authentication and our authorization, things along those lines. So that's another topic that is covered in SENS here. Also, the different traffic telemetry methods that are recommended for our infrastructure devices like NTP, how to deploy it and how to secure it. Things like logging, how to set up logging and how to do that securely. Also, NetFlow is a topic that is covered in SENS. And so, again, important aspects of the operation of our network devices, but definitely something that you would need to understand from a security angle, how we're going to implement these in a secure fashion and make sure that we're doing things the right way. We also need to understand layer 2 security controls. So we're not just locked into controlling security on our routers and our switches. We also, on our routers and our ASAs as edge network devices, but we also do need to secure our layer 2 devices. So the SENS course, believe it or not, talks about private VLANs. So that's a security feature that's covered. The security of DHCP. So we've got different aspects there. DHCP snooping being one of them. Also dynamic ARP inspection, another topic that is covered in the SENS course. You've got other things like storm control and MACsec encryption, which is sort of a new technology that we're seeing more and more these days, being able to secure layer 2 across a link. And we can do that between an endpoint and the switch or between switch to switch, provided we've got switches that support the feature. So this is also covered in SENS. We have things like how to prevent spoofing. So remember, we're talking about routers at the edge in this course as being one of the devices that we need to secure. So we've got features like unicast reverse path filtering. We've got IP source guard. And so you need to understand that as well for the SENS exam. So that is a big chunk of knowledge that you've got to obtain for SENS, and that's covered in the second module of the SENS course. Now remember, I said there's 5 modules. It's a 5-day course, so you're looking at about, if you were to go through the training on this, about a module per day. So it's quite a bit of information. The third module is the NAT deployment, and like I said, the NAT is on Cisco iOS as well as on Cisco ASAs. So you need to understand for SENS inside and outside NAT. You need to understand static and dynamic NAT, policy-based NAT, and be able to configure those. Also, you may recall that the ASA, once we went from 8.2 to 8.3, Cisco really changed the way that NAT works on an ASA. So being able to configure things like network object NAT and static NAT using network object NAT is important to understand. Also dynamic NAT and dynamic PAT with network objects, and then manual NAT, twice NAT, things along those lines with the ASA. You need to be able to configure that. You need to be able to work with that and understand Cisco's current method of configuring NAT on the ASAs. The routers, on the other hand, the NAT configurations there have been the same for quite some time. So you've got static and dynamic NAT there, static and dynamic PAT, policy-based dynamic NAT that you'll need to understand to pass the SENS exam as well. That's all fair game. And then the fourth area that's covered, the fourth module in the course, the fourth topical area is threat control deployments on the ASA. So the ASA just has a ton of features as far as threat control goes. And so there's different filtering approaches and technologies that can be used. And so you need to gain an understanding of those different features and capabilities that the ASA has. Things like just regular access control, being able to work with your connection tables and understand what a stateful connection is and how to be able to view your stateful connections, what type of connections are stateful, what your local host table is, how to handle configuring and applying interface ACLs and how that changes maybe default security policy of the ASA, where you've got high security level to low security level, high, low, go type traffic, where we're allowing those outbound connections, which is what that would be considered. So that's definitely something that you need to understand. Also configuring global ACLs and how that affects the default functionality of the firewall, and also the modular policy framework. So layer 3-4 policies, layer 5 through 7 policies, even going so deep as to be able to inspect HTTP, inspect FTP, inspect these application layer protocols that do things a little bit differently. You need to be able to do that, to understand that, to be able to configure that. And you also need to understand reputation-based access policies on the ASA, which is talking about our botnet filtering. So you have to have an understanding of what botnet filtering is, how it works, where we get the information on the reputation, and that type of stuff. So that's, for the most part, the access policies on the ASA. Oh, there is another section where you do need to be familiar with the identity firewall and how to integrate the ASA with Active Directory. So you're going to need an agent, and the ASA will talk using the agent to Active Directory and be able to provide identity-based firewall services for end users. And then the last section is the threat control deployment on your Cisco iOS software. This is where you would configure zone-based policy firewalls. So if you're already familiar with zone-based policy firewalls, you're probably pretty comfortable with this section. That's being able to go in and set up your layer 3, layer 4, interzone access policy, also intrazone access policies, control plane and management plane traffic, how you would deal with that with a zone-based firewall, how you would apply policy to that, how you would support NAT, and how you would troubleshoot a zone-based firewall. You also would need to understand some of the deeper inspection capabilities of the zone-based firewall. So you may know that an ASA can inspect HTTP, but did you know that an iOS router using a zone-based policy firewall can also inspect HTTP? In fact, it can inspect instant messaging and peer-to-peer applications, and it can do URL filtering and things along those lines. In fact, if you don't want to work with an external URL filtering provider, like a WebSense server or something along those lines, did you know that you could configure a local list of URLs that you want to filter right on the router itself? So that's also a part of SENS and what you would need to understand to be able to make it through this exam. So a lot of topics there, but that is the SENS course in a nutshell. Now I'm going to go through the additional courses and give you this overview, but like I said, I just want you to have an understanding of what is covered in each of these courses from a high level. I'm not going to go into any of the detailed topics, but just give you an idea of what you should be looking for. Now, the SITCS exam. So like I said, we've got SENS, which we just covered. We have SITCS, which is really designed to give you application visibility and control. This is your appliance-based web security, cloud web security, email security, and your IPS. So the domains that Cisco covers in this are content security and threat defense. And so some of the job skills that you'd be looking at being able to perform would be to implement the Cisco next-gen firewall services on the ASA CX, implement your WSAs and ESAs, implement your cloud web security, or set up content security reporting and tracking, do things like implement network IPS. So these are all job tasks that would fall under the content security and the threat defense domain, which is what this course covers. From a high level, we begin with the ASA CX next-gen firewall services, move into cloud web security and the web security appliance, and the email security appliance, the ESAs, and then the IPS systems. So again, where before Cisco had a course that was just specifically dedicated to the IPS sensors, the 4200 series sensors, this is much more specific to being able to, deploy the current trends, which is around securing web, securing email, securing cloud stuff. And so again, this uses the 5515s and the 5512s, uses the 2901s. One of the things that's really neat about this new CCNP Security is that the topology that we use in the courses is identical for each of the classes. And that's a significant change when you compare it to the past, where each of these courses you would come in and it would be a completely different set of equipment. The topology would not be a real life topology. In just a moment, I'll show you an example of the topology. But I'll wait till we kind of get through that. I actually blogged about it, so I didn't plan on putting it in here simply because I've already shown through the blog what the topology is, but I'll still cover it in a little bit of detail. But you'll find that it's a much more realistic topology, and I think it's going to do a real good job at preparing not only candidates that are trying to get certified, but just candidates that want to know, how to secure a network and how to work in a real world. So, like I said, with this SITCS or SITCS course here, you begin with the ASA next-gen firewalls, give you the rundown on the features and the components and the compatibility with existing features. When we're talking about the CX and then we're talking about the existing ASAs, there's some differences there. So we talk about that and give you a chance to look at some of the management architecture of the CX, the CLI operations, the management interface, the licensing. It's important to understand that too. Also, some of the policy objects. We talk about how to configure the ASA to ASA traffic redirection, the policy structure, policy objects, network objects, URLs and user agents and identity objects, so basically covering all of these different elements that we call policy objects. We also talk about how to monitor the ASA CX and the dashboards and the reports that we can run and being able to look at our event viewer and so on. So that's the CX. We also have access policies that we'll configure. We'll teach you how to configure that in the course, and you'll be tested on that if you end up taking the SITCS exam. You definitely need to be able to configure access policies on the ASA. things like URL filters and web reputation profiles, and be able to troubleshoot these policies. And then there's also identity policies. So this is where we talk about active and passive authentications, how to perform that, different authentication realms, how to configure identity-based policies, and how to integrate with the Active Directory agent, how to set up active and passive authentications, how to tune those authentication settings. Okay. If you take the course on this and you've never set up an identity-based policy, you actually get to do that. We have a lab on that you work through. Also, there's decryption policies. And so you need to understand how to configure the CX decryption policies so that it matches the security requirements that we have in place. So you need to understand decryption policies and how to configure the decryption and configure those policies, and then of course be able to troubleshoot that if there is a need. I mentioned that we cover web security as well in the course, and yes, that's the Cisco Web Security Appliance. This is the iron port stuff. So all your malware detection, your reputation-based filtering, your acceptable policy, all that kind of stuff would be in that section. You would need to be able to configure the explicit or the transparent proxy modes. And if you don't understand what those are, you'll need to. You'll be tested on that as well. Understand what a pack file is and how to deploy those packs, and how to perform traffic redirection if you're operating in a transparent mode. And then also there's that WCCP that's sitting there. And so you need to understand how that works. There are some little gotchas if you're using an ASA and doing WCCP. So we want to understand how that works, and that's definitely something that you'd also be tested on. Some other things that we configure on the WSA is things like our user authentication, authentication protocols and schemes, joining the WSA to AD. Also, we discuss LDAP and how to configure an LDAP realm for our LDAP servers and how to integrate it with LDAP. That's also covered. Acceptable use controls on the WSA is also covered. And then also the anti-malware controls on the web security appliance would be covered. Web reputation filtering, adaptive scanning, and malware scanning, and things of that nature. Also, the decryption capabilities, being an HTTPS proxy. So you need to understand how that works on the WSA and be able to enable that HTTPS proxy and configure those decryption policies. And then also understand the data security policy control that you have within the ASA, and be able to handle the data loss prevention add-on and so on. So that's your Cisco WSA portion of the SITCS course, the SITCS exam. And you also need to understand cloud web security. If you're not working with that, you need to understand the cloud web security, be able to configure the cloud web security connectors if you've never done that. So that's something that's covered in the course, things like whitelists and different identity options. So we do a ISR G2 Cloud Web Security overview. We discuss that as well. We talk about the ISR G2 Cloud Web Security configuration and verification, and also talk about Cloud Web Security and how it integrates with the WSA. We show you how to work with the web filtering policy in the Cisco Scan Center. And you also have a lab in the course that we work through on configuring that Cloud Web Security Connector for your ISR G2s. So I point this out because some of these things that we have labs on, those labs often become simulates in the exams. Now, I'm not saying that these specifically are, however, anything that you would do through the Cisco course as an exam would be a prime target for being able to capture that and convert that into a simulator or a simulate and then test you on that in the exam. We also cover the Cisco email security appliance in the exam. So you need to understand SMTP. You need to understand the terminology that's related to it, what an SMTP flow is, what an SMTP conversation is. And then once you understand that, then we can start to talk about the ESA and how to manage the ESA, how to license it, how we process incoming and outgoing mail, and then also how we can integrate it with LDAP. Okay, so we cover all of that. We talk about the basic setup of the ESA, and we have a deployment scenario that we work through, which is a one listener deployment scenario, and we go through quite a good step through of that deployment scenario there. We also go through the incoming and outgoing mail policies. You need to be familiar with that as well. Things like policy, virus, and outbreak quarantine configurations, spam quarantine configurations, how to set up anti-spam, the data loss prevention features of the ESA. You need to be familiar with that as well, and should be able to configure those basic policies on the ESA with no problem. And then, of course, the Cisco IPS is covered in here. So, you know, there's still, while the technology has advanced, there's still a place for IPS in the network. So we talk about how to integrate an IPS sensor into the network. You need to understand how to deploy sensors in either inline or promiscuous mode, how to configure promiscuous interfaces, and then how to configure interface pairs. If you've never done that, you should be familiar with how to configure these interface pairs. Also configuring the IPS for some of its basic operations, like how to adjust your IPS signatures, how to control your risk rating, and how risk rating is calculated, and how threat rating works into that, and then also all your event action filters, event action overrides, and how to use IDM to control all of this. And you also need to be able to work fairly well with your IPS signatures. So the better you are at working with your IPS signatures, the better you're going to be at managing your false positives and controlling the false positives and the false negatives that you see. That is certainly a trait or a characteristic that you will need if you're going to be deploying Cisco IPS sensors. A lot of people have that misconception of I can just drop a sensor in, it's got a default config on it, and Cisco enables most of what's important. That's not entirely true, and everybody's network is different. So because of the fact that everybody's network is different, it's to your benefit to spend the time understanding what your network looks like, what's normal, what's not normal, and then tuning your IPS signatures to match. Also, what do you do if there's a day zero attack? Well, you can have custom signatures. Now, do you know how to configure custom signatures? Because Cisco is going to test you on it in this exam. So you want to definitely be aware of how to configure those. And then the IPS does have reputation-based filtering that it can do as well. So that's the SITCS exam. And again, like I said, it's web security, email security, cloud security, and IPS. Now, the next one that I've got listed here is SIMOS. Now, the SIMOS is designed to really give you a good introduction to VPNs. I mean, that's really what it is. This is going to cover things like site-to-site VPNs, Flex VPN, for those of you that are into some of the newer stuff. IKE v2 is covered in here. And then also some of the SSL VPN technologies, clientless SSL VPN, AnyConnect VPNs for both SSL and IPsec. And then also there's endpoint security that we can apply in a VPN situation. So That's what we cover in the SIMOS course. The SIMOS course, like I said, it's very specific. Some of you may have signed up and got the mind map, which I just sort of started brain dumping some of the topics that are in SIMOS, and we're doing that for every one of our classes, giving our students the mind maps of the course to give them something to just quickly go back, especially before you take an exam, and run through each of those areas and see all the major topics that are covered there. This is also going to cover very specific domain, and that domain is the implementation of cryptography and of virtual private networking. So one of the things that we try to focus on throughout the course is giving you the fundamentals of VPN and cryptography, understanding everything that's behind it when it comes to the different VPN types or the different VPN components. If it's your different cryptographic algorithms, what confidentiality is, what integrity is, and understanding the difference between the two, how your keys are handled. I know when it comes to encryption right now, everybody's like, oh no, Heartbleed is out there, and we've got this problem with SSL VPNs and using open SSL. And in fact, I saw Juniper just came out with an alert today because their devices are subject to the Heartbleed issue because they've used OpenVPN for their SSL VPN. So there's definitely some things to consider there. Just understanding how all this works gives you sort of a benefit when we start looking at problems like Heartbleed and saying, okay, am I susceptible to that particular attack that's out here right now? Did I secure my network properly? Am I using protocols that are now considered to be vulnerable because of things that we've just learned? The SIMOS also covers site-to-site VPN solutions. So just understanding how to set up a site-to-site with either IKE v1 or IKE v2, what ESP is, the encapsulating security payload, and how we can operate in tunnel mode, meaning we can take our public addresses and we can tunnel private IP addressing through that public networking. Also understanding what a virtual tunnel interface is on our Cisco routers, what DMVPN is on our Cisco routers, what Flex VPN is. There's a number of VPN technologies that are covered in here that apply to the routers that the ASA is not capable of doing. So we do need to understand point-to-point or site-to-site VPNs with an ASA, but we also need to understand that there's a number of solutions that the ASA does not support. The ASA does not support tunnel interfaces. So we can't do GRE tunnels and push routing across an encrypted tunnel with tunnel protection on it. We don't have that capability with the ASA. So important to understand what our options are, what we can do on the router, what we can do on the ASA. Also with the VPNs, the VTI-based point-to-point IPsec VPNs, understanding that there are static and there are dynamic virtual tunnel interfaces. When would you use a dynamic VTI? When would you use a static VTI? Can I do NAT on a VTI interface? Okay, so see, these are some of the things that we need to understand for the SIMOS exam and for this particular domain of functional work that we might have to perform. Also, DMVPNs. So what are the elements of DMVPN? Do you know what they are? DMVPN is not just one single component. It's a combination of GRE or rather MGRE, NHRP, the Next Hop Resolution Protocol, and then IPsec, putting IPsec together with that. Being able to do routing in a DMVPN, being able to configure the hub and then configure the spokes, and understanding how NHRP is used for resolution of our hub addressing. Okay, so these are all DMVPN topics that you need to understand for SIMOS. You need to be able to implement a DMVPN. You've got Flex VPN solutions. So what is the Flex VPN architecture? Do you know what that is? Do you understand Flex VPN capabilities and the difference between IKE v1 and IKE v2? Do you know the IKE v2 message exchange? Did you know that IKE v2 does not have multiple phases. So in IPsec, we have phase 1 and we have phase 2. Phase 1, we do main mode or aggressive mode, and in phase 2, we do quick mode. Well, the modes, the phases don't exist in IKE v2. The way that it operates is different. So we have parent and child essays. How are they set up? These are things that you would need to know with Flex VPN and with IKE v2 and so on. Nice thing about the course is we also take a look at a Flex VPN use case and see where it fits. And so you need to be able to deploy that. You need to be able to do hub and spoke IPsec VPNs using Flex VPN. You need to be able to do spoke to spoke IPsec VPNs using Flex VPN. Okay, so more than one way to skin a cat. So we may be using DMVPN for spoke to spoke. Can you do that with Flex VPN? Right. So some different ways to do things. And then also clientless SSL VPN is a popular technology that we're seeing these days. So understanding what clientless SSL VPN is, understanding the SSL session setup and how the keys are managed, how we do server authentication, and that's required, how we have an optional client authentication, how do we set that up, how do we protect SSL transmission, and then, of course, can we deploy it? So can we deploy that clientless SSL VPN on an ASA? We need to be able to implement that. Can we control application access? So once we have access into that clientless SSL VPN, then we've got our ability to use these different plugins to control our application access. So Telnet, SSH, remote desktop, Citrix, things like that. We also have smart tunnels that we could set up. We can control authentication and authorization in that clientless SSL VPN using a local CA server or using an external AAA server even for authentication and authorization. We could have multiple authentications, right? Do a dual authentication. And some networks are requiring that these days. And then in addition to that clientless VPN, we need to understand how to deploy AnyConnect VPN. So the AnyConnect VPN, we've got two types. We've got SSL VPN, and which we would consider full tunnel. Well, how do we deploy that? Because there are some differences between the full tunnel AnyConnect VPN and the clientless SSL VPN, even though they're using the same protocol. Then we've got things like split tunneling and how to set that up. Also connection profiles and being able to work with those. There's also a parallel DTLS tunnel. What is DTLS? Okay, so you think about your traffic that's real-time traffic. TCP traffic, which is what TLS uses, does this three-way handshake, and if packets are dropped, we do retransmissions. But real-time traffic doesn't require that. So our UDP-based traffic, like our voice, can actually do a DTLS, which is datagram TLS, which then encapsulates it into UDP, which is a much better way to go for our real-time application. So you need to understand that. Also things like trusted network detection, start before logon. How do we do that? Well, I'll tell you what, the first time I configured SBL, I couldn't figure out how to get it to kick off. Did you know in the Windows lock screen, there's a little kind of widget button that is the network access button that you have to click on that'll allow you to initiate the SBL. So where's that at, right? So you need to understand that, be able to figure that out and deploy that start before logon feature. Authentication, authorization, there's two factors there. Local authentication, certificate-based authentication. There's just a number of things there that you need to be familiar with. And then also there is the IKE v2. So did you know that we can actually take a full tunnel SSL VPN and we can convert it to an IPsec VPN? And did you also know that when you do an IKE v2 IPsec VPN with an AnyConnect client, that you're also setting up an SSL VPN in parallel? And the reason for that is because IKE is not equipped to carry things like profile updates and updates of the client, but SSL is. So we set up the parallel connection, and then we do the management stuff over the SSL, and we encrypt the data over the IPsec. Okay, so we talk about that in the course, and of course you need to understand that for the SIMOS exam. And then we have endpoint security and dynamic access policies. So this is things like security posture on the end device when they connect in. Making sure that we scan the host and that they have a certain firewall running. We can do DAP policies, dynamic access policies. So there's a hierarchy to this. There's a default DAP that's applied. We want to be able to go in and modify the default DAP on our ASAs and adjust that. So that is the SIMOS course. Again, just a full set of VPN features that you definitely are going to need to be familiar with. And then finally, the SISAS, implementing Cisco Security Access Solutions. This is one of my favorite courses. I mean, I really like the SIMOS course because a lot of the content that's in SIMOS came from the VPN 2.0 course, or it was derived from that course before it was updated. And I had the privilege of developing that course for Cisco. But the SISAS course, as I call it, which probably isn't the greatest name for it, but SISAS, or SISAS course, as I've heard some people call it, is Identity Services Engine. And man, I really like ICE. I've been doing a lot of ICE deployments lately, getting an opportunity to throw these in all kinds of scenarios. And so SISAS is about deploying Cisco ICE. It's about 802.1x and MAB and SGA and MACsec and WebAuth and guest services and posturing and all those features, profiling, that come in an identity services engine. There's actually a course called SISE, which we've been teaching for a long time now, and that course is a product training course on the Cisco Identity Services Engine. Well, while there's some overlap in this course with the features and the configurations, this course, again, is very specific to, hey, in a real world, these are some of the things that you're going to be configuring. We may not be showing you every single knob that you're going to turn on, but you may not be turning those knobs on. Not everybody wants a light dimmed to a certain shade of orange. Most people, they just want to plug the light bulb in and flip the switch and have it work. So this course really teaches you how to flip the switch, how to put it in with features that have to be configured and have that working. So one of the modules, or the first module that we cover, is threat mitigation through identity services. We talk about the modular network architecture again. Remember, that was covered in that first course that I had talked about. We talk about secure access control and what authentication and authorization and accounting are. We talk about what COA is. It's a key feature in using Cisco Ice, the ability to use radius to tell a switch or to tell an access point, hey, something has changed with this device. Let's reauthorize them so that we can apply new policy. Also, external identity sources, right? Not only just using ICE for policy configuration, but hey, let's go authenticate this user in Active Directory or LDAP. And oh, by the way, let's look at some of the attributes there that are either related to the user or the host that they're on. And then based on that machine in AD or that user in AD, we can pull these attributes and we can filter and apply policy based on those attributes. And we can do all of this through Radius. So it's pretty cool stuff. Now, some of the underlying technology, the fundamental pieces here, is going to be 802.1x. So you need to understand how to configure 802.1x port-based authentication control on your switches, how to set it up for VLAN assignments, understand what a downloadable ACL is, because that's a huge piece of the policy that we apply. We also need to understand how to configure a phased deployment, what monitor mode is, low impact mode, closed mode, how to deploy those. What are some of the guidelines we should follow when we do a phased deployment so that we're just not locking everybody out all of a sudden? Also, authentication bypass. What do we do for devices that can't do 802.1x? Well, can we do a MAC authentication bypass? Yeah, sure. How do we set that up? You need to be able to configure that in ICE. Also, you need to understand different features and capabilities of EAP and EAP chaining and the operation there. How the Cisco AnyConnect 3.x client is a supplicant for EAP. So we go through a quick start. We talk about setting up the local database. We get you familiar with the ICE interface and go through the default authentication policies in there and how those are set up and what happens if we fail authentication. What's our go-to after that? We configure our switches. We configure a Windows native supplicant. You need to be able to be familiar with that. And then just get a host authenticated into ICE. Or using ICE. So a lot of this, I mean, we kind of call this the bootstrapping of ICE, but really it's, like 6 major things that we need to do. If we're just doing a very simple non-external identity store configuration, we need to have a local user in ICE. We need to have the switch in ICE. We need to have the switch configured for AAA and 802.1x. All the radius settings there to carry the vendor specific attributes and support the COA. And we would then configure that switch to be in a monitoring mode and then configure our supplicant and go ahead and do an authentication, see if we can get authenticated there. So it's not difficult, but there's a lot of, I don't know if you call them moving parts, but there's a lot of steps that we have to go through with ICE to be able to configure this stuff. So we go through that basics there, and that's all done in just the first module of the course. So you can imagine if this SISAS is an exam, what we just talked about might sound like a lot, but it's just a fragment of what we could see on the exam. Understanding all of the ICE features, what an ICE persona is. So maybe you've heard that term already, ICE personas. So we can be operating as in an admin role, and we can be a policy services node. A policy services node is a persona that we can assume. We can be a monitoring node, and so on. You need to understand what those are, and you need to understand some of the deployment examples. Also, being able to enroll ICE into a PKI, get a certificate on ICE. I like to take people through how to install not only a standard identity certificate, but a wildcard certificate. That's become more and more popular these days. And if you're going to be doing anything like guest authentication with a captive web portal, you don't want those guests coming on the network being given a certificate that says, hey, this certificate is not known and not trusted. It was issued by your Active Directory server. No, we don't want that. We want to be able to have this certificate that's presented that says, oh, hey, Mr. Browser, I am a certificate that comes from DigiCert, and look and make sure that you know me. And then the browser goes, oh, yeah, I know who DigiCert is. DigiCert signed this? Okay, I trust them. Or GoDaddy, or whoever it is, VeriSign and trust, whoever it is that we're going to trust. So I like to talk through how to get that configured and really give you an understanding of your options when it comes to enrolling with a PKI environment. And then, of course, for management connections, you're going to be HTTPSing into ICE, but also from the perspective of not only management, but your EAP connections. Remember, with EAP, server authentication is going to happen every time. The server is going to identify itself to the client. The client needs to accept that. That's all done through a certificate. And so we need to understand how that's configured as well. ICE authentication, the configuration of authentication policies is separate from the authorization policies. And to be honest with you, most of the work is going to be done within an authorization policy with ICE. So you do need to understand what authentication conditions are and how to define simple conditions and advanced conditions and what allowed protocols are. But once you get the authentication, that's a very small piece of this. Now, with authentication, we can do MAC authentication bypass, so we can have local MAC addresses. Everything in ICE, when it comes to a machine, is for the most part tied to a MAC address. So you need to understand how to do MAB and how to deploy that. And then also not only just MAB, but also how to do an internal user database and get your users to authenticate to that. Also, our external authentication with ICE, being able to integrate with Active Directory, being able to go in and pull in not only group information, but to query a host or to query a user and to pull the attributes in AD into ICE and then be able to plug those attributes into a policy. So that's some pretty powerful capability there. So you need to be able to do that, to be able to add those devices, to bring those in. Hey, if you've got a CCO account, you can get a 90-day eval of ICE and just install that in ESX. And if you don't have an ability to get ESX, I've seen people install VMware ESXi in VirtualBox, and then on top of that put ICE. So if you've got the juice in your machine to do it, you can definitely work up your own home lab. But we do that in the labs in the Cisco authorized course that we offer. We do external authentication with Active Directory. We don't get too deep into the LDAP authentication, but I do know that there are a lot of people using LDAP out there. So I like to spend a little bit of time talking about that, but I won't right now because that may bore some of you. There's also the certificate-based user authentication. Now, how do I authenticate a user with a certificate? Well, when I'm doing certificate-based authentication of a user, I've got to go off box and use external authentication. So these are our different EAP methods like EAP TLS and how to configure the supplicant and how to configure Active Directory, or actually how to have that user in Active Directory and issue them a certificate and all that kind of stuff. Now, authorization. So authorization has a number of components that kind of plug into it. So when it comes to authorization, you've got your authorization policy, but your policy has these modular elements that it references. Now, the elements, you typically would create these ahead of time. So let's say that our policy is going to be for certain groups in Active Directory. When those users authorize, we're going to push down a ACL to that user. Well, the ACL needs to be pre-configured in ICE. Then we would configure an authorization profile, which references the ACL. And by the way, authorization profiles, they're going to let me do all kinds of things like web redirection, pushing down ACLs, applying filters that exist on the device already, just a ton of options like that. But then once we configure that authorization profile, now we can plug that authorization profile into the authorization policy. So you need to understand how to build these conditions and how the rule logic works and how to configure each of these elements, like I said, to be able to plug them into a policy that you want to put together. So that's all part of implementing authorization. Also, it's a good idea to understand some of the additional things like how TrustSec works, SGT, secure group tagging, and how we can sort of abstract the policy from a device and lay it on top of the entire topology. So what I'm talking about there is having the ability to take data that comes in from a user, and because of who we know that user to be, applying an SGT, a security group tag, to their data, which is then transported throughout the network, and then at different enforcement points, applying a security group ACLs, SGACLs. So we can do SGACLs at egress and apply policy to data that came in on the other side of the network and just got tagged because of who that user was. So we have SGACLs, we have SG firewalls we can deploy there, and again, do things based on that tag. So we need to understand how that works and how that's configured. And then also, another important feature that a lot of people are trying to implement these days is that layer 2 encryption across a link. We call that MACsec, or MAC security. This is a hop-by-hop implementation of encryption, so doing an AES encryption across a hop. So those are some of the things that we would do as far as authorization goes and authentication. That's all great for users that we know, but what about for users that we don't know? How do we handle that? Well, in those situations, for users that we don't know, we're going to want to do a web authentication and provide guest access. And ICE has a lot of those features as well. So you need to understand how the web auth process works, how we kind of go through authentications, and rather than failing if the user doesn't authenticate, we kick them to a captive web portal. And from that captive web portal, we can authenticate the user based on guest credentials that somebody in our organization can create through a sponsor portal. Okay, so that's all part of WebAuth. WebAuth is sort of the beginning of that, and the end of that is the guest services features that we have to deploy. So guest services, we have a guest portal that we can customize. We also have a sponsor portal that we can customize. And so we need to understand how to configure and manage and handle who can create guest accounts, how those guest accounts are created. One of the things I like to do, it sounds so subtle, but one of the things that I like to do with a guest account is I like to say that guest accounts don't use the number 1 and they don't use the letter L or I, and they don't use uppercase O, because whenever you issue to a user, whenever you issue authentication credentials that actually use those values, users get confused. So what I like to do is I like to go in and configure my sponsor portal so that when it issues randomly generated passwords and usernames, it doesn't use any of those characters that are going to confuse people. Now, this just sounds really simple, right? But it's part of the configuration of our guest access and our web authentication. There's also endpoint access control things that we can do, and this kind of leads into that whole BYOD discussion, right? When somebody comes on the network, how do we know what their machine looks like? So we want to be able to posture them. We want to be able to provision them if it need be. And so that's something that we can do with ICE, and that you need to understand how to implement the posture service feature. So we need to be able to posture. We also need to be able to profile. Profiler is kind of cool. I like to go into a network and set up ICE and just leave it there for a couple days and then come back and go, oh yeah, by the way, ICE was profiling your network. Here's everything that it sees already. And so there's different things that we can do to get ICE to learn what kind of devices are on the network. And so there's profiling policies that can be configured, and you need to understand those as well for the SISAS exam. You also need to be able to implement BYOD, right? So you need to be able to set it up so that somebody can bring an iPhone in and gain guest access and accept an acceptable use policy and be provisioned with access. I'll give you an example of access that you might need to provision. Maybe you've got a user that comes in and they're an employee on the network and they're going to bring their phone in and they want to get their phone on the network. Well, you don't want them authenticating as a guest, because if they authenticate as a guest, then what's going to happen is they're not going to get the privileges that they need on the network, maybe to check their email or whatever. So, or maybe on the guest network we're doing this really low QoSing with policing or something like that. So we don't want employees to be subjected to that. So we set up a guest SID, and a user comes in, and it could be a user on our network or it could be a guest, and they get presented with this guest portal. Well, if they have guest credentials, they authenticate and they get web access. Okay, easy enough. But if it's one of our users, what we need to happen is the user needs to put in their Active Directory credentials or LDAP or whatever database we're using that we've integrated with ICE. They need to be able to authenticate. And then once they authenticate, we need to use that change of authorization with ICE to go back to the switch or the access point actually and say, yo, AP, we need to reapply policy here because this is actually a user on our network. And so we go through this provisioning process where we push down certificates and we push down a connection profile. Now the connection profile tells that employee disconnect from guest and reconnect to employee. Now employee is a SID that's not broadcast, but now that they have the profile, they can connect to this SID, SSID in our network that's on the employee network. And at that point, then they'll go ahead and authenticate using the certificate that was pushed down during provisioning. So it kicks them over to the new one. That's what they call a dual SID flow. And so you need to be able to do that with BYOD. And then another area that you need to be familiar with is access control troubleshooting. Being able to troubleshoot those different features. Troubleshoot radius authentication and 802.1x problems and your ICE policies. And I mean, these are features that, if you can troubleshoot these, life is going to be much smoother for you. So that is, wow, that's like an hour dump of what you would see in the new CCNP program. So it may sound like a lot to you. That's because it is. There's quite a bit, and it's a major change, and it's one of the it's probably the best CCNP set of courses for security that I've seen Cisco put together so far. I mean, it's just so relevant with what we do today. It's timely. They hit all the important topics right now. And another thing that Learning at Cisco has done that is just amazing is they've put together this new development method. This is kind of internal stuff with them to where they are able to update and deploy changes to a course much more rapidly. So it would not surprise me if we start to see our CCNP security update more frequently as technology changes nowadays. All right, so that is an update of everything that we now see in the CCNP security. So what are we doing here at Global Config? I figured I'd give you the rundown on what we're planning on doing. I know a lot of people are chattering about it, but a lot of the products out there to help you prep, they're just not there right now. All 4 courses are available right now. We do have those available, and they're 5-day courses. So each of the 5-day courses, you've got 20 days worth of training there. And those are live instructor led. And typically those are done through not GoToWebinar, but GoToTraining, a product similar to this, only for that training. I typically have the camera on, and we encourage all the students to have the cameras on so that it feels like we're in a class. And we do polling, and you have lab access, and we do some lectures, and we go through some demonstrations, and then we do some labs. We do that for a week for each course, and it's a lot of fun. Really good material in there. We're also putting together a 12-day boot camp that will be available at the end of May. So you'll have 12 days, and you'll get all 4 kits, and we're going to hammer through all of it. And then also at the end of May, we're going to have the video on demand. I know a lot of people are asking for those VODs, and so we're going to be having VODs available for each of those courses at the end of May, and we're going to offer those on an individual basis, or you'll be able to buy a subscription to gain access to everything. And then, of course, because of running this webinar and having a lot of interest here that we've seen in the last little bit, we're offering for those who attended the webinar for this weekend only. So next 3 days, I think it is, basically ends on Monday. You can get 50% off any of the new CCNP security courses. Just go to our website, and when you register at the checkout page, use the coupon code CCNP webinar, and that'll take 50% off the $3,200 price tag that's on those courses. So we know that these courses are not cheap courses, but they are very well developed courses that provide you access to equipment that is very difficult to get your hands on. So we try to provide that, and we want to do it at a reasonable cost too. So you get to spend some time with me. Now, another thing that's beneficial for the CCNP security courses, between now and the time that the VODs are developed and released, which are already in production, between now and then, for those of you that take the CCNP security courses at this 50% off special offer, you'll also be given access to the recording of the class that you took. The class is recorded, and then you're given a membership portal access to be able to review any of the VODs from that specific course. Once the formal VODs are released, those who take the actual live course are given access to the VOD course, which has a lot more demonstrations in it and spends a lot more time on some of the specific topics. So anyhow, that is the CCNP security update. I want to thank you for being here, for attending. Chat is open, so if you would like and you have some questions, please feel free to chat them to me. Like I said, I'm going to go ahead and make the recording of this available. If you want to go back through anything, you'll be able to scrub through it. But thanks for attending, everybody, and hope to be able to help you out in some way, whether it's through the blog and some of the technical articles that we've got going on there, or if I see you in a live training class, just want to be able to help contribute to your success and appreciate you being here. Thank you, Robert. You're welcome. Okay. I think we melted the minds of many. So yeah, it's definitely a very cool program, and it's attainable. It's not the CCIE, but I'll tell you what, going through this, you'll be very well prepared for the CCIE when you work into that. It aligns very well with the CCIE. Okay, well, I think we're wrapping up our questions here. I've responded privately to some. Okay. Well, again, thanks everybody for joining. And we'll see you again in another webinar, hopefully. Thanks a lot.